I'm joined today by John Waters. John needs nearly no introduction. I spoke to him before at great length. So John, thanks a million for talking to me again today.
Pleasure, Fergus. How are you?
I'm just curious, how's your health? Because the last time you told me about Ramsay-Hunt syndrome and all that. So
Yeah,
how's that coming along?
I think that was about September, was it?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah. To be honest, I'm a little better, but not as much as you kind of would expect or think, because that's one of the things I found about this condition, that it's really snail's pace, the recovery. Uh, and there is a kind of an outer limit. And I don't know, I haven't reached it yet. It's still moving, but it's moving, in total slow-mo style. So, but I am better in some ways. Other ways I'm not. I mean, I'm wearing two earpieces, but
Yes.
only one of them is relevant because I'm completely deaf in this ear, here.
I heard you talking about that.
Yeah. I don't know if that's going to come back, Fergus. I mean, I'm not being melodramatic about it, but that's kind of I kind of have to be prepared to reconcile myself to that possibility, I'm told. So, but then again, it might come back. They reckon that you can't really kind of give up on the whole thing for about 18 months after it starts, and that would be kind of the back end of this year, so come September, October, November, that kind of time. So, I'm hopeful, but I'm also, I suppose, prepared to face reality if that's what comes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what, do you mind me asking you, what health care have you encountered? Because you'll probably be aware that the difference in America between public and private is probably greater than in Ireland.
Oh yeah.
While we do have two separate systems, it's not quite as stark maybe as it might be in America. So are you doing that? Where do you go for all your treatment and everything?
Well, as it happens, I mean, I've been ill twice. This is my second serious illness in 2 years. I had cancer last year and I had an operation for kidney cancer. And that was a really good experience. Both times I was in St. Vincent's, and that was, the cancer was straightforward, surprisingly. This was less so because, not through any fault of anybody, in the sense that everybody was doing their absolute utmost to help me, but there just isn't a lot known about this condition, and very few doctors have ever come across a case of it. It's very rare. Like hundreds of thousands, that's very, very rare. So, and there isn't a particular, it seems, insofar as I can ascertain, there are no kind of clear conditions. Once you get over the initial period where there's a kind of a fire brigade action with antivirals and antibiotics and all that. After that, you're kind of, I mean, one doctor, I was in Spain for a while, and the doctor I met there, she had actually seen 20 cases of it, and she said there are two cures for it: time and patience. And I'm not sure I have a lot of either of those. So I'm kind of just waiting, and I'm doing certain therapeutic things, like with for my face, which is kind of still. I had palsy on this side of my face, and still have, which means, you possibly, people who know me will certainly notice, although they're much too polite to say so, that my mouth is kind of out of shape and on the wrong, it's a little bit, pulling to one side, like a Ford Anglia years ago, that we had. And there's kind of, my eye has come on a lot, actually, this eye here, which I couldn't close for a long time, and now I can, but it's still not in tune with the other one. If you notice me, my eyes blink alternately, and not as opposed to together in harmony. They've lost their harmony, and so on. But I'm able to function.
Yes.
My energy levels are not great, so I have to really kind of pace myself through the day and not take on too many stressful things. And what I'm up to at the moment isn't really conducive to the lack of stress, I'm afraid.
No, you're in a completely new environment, I gather. So I want to ask you, what's that process like, from, I suppose, layman to political candidate?
Well, it's actually not that much of a leap in a sense. I mean, I think there's been an awful lot said about this that is actually completely wrong. I don't feel that I'm any different. I don't feel that my life is any different, really. I mean, there's stress, there's added stress, and there's added kind of, you know, I don't know, just a general sense of turmoil in your life. But the whole thing is much simpler and straightforward than you think it's going to be. I mean, it's very much like driving when you're driving in a foreign country where you have to go on the other side of the road to the one you're used to. You think, without doing it, you think, oh, this would be terrible. I'll be constantly going to the wrong side of the road. I'll be constantly making mistakes. And the reality is that the situation decides itself for you 98% of the time. You know what you have to do. There's only one or two situations in that, I'm talking about the driving thing, where you actually have to suddenly be careful. And just make a note for yourself that, oh, I'm in a dangerous situation. One of those is, for example, if you're on a one-way street and there's a roundabout at the end of it,
yes,
you're prone to go the wrong way around that.
Yeah.
You know, because you don't know which side of the road you're on. So that kind of thing. Otherwise, you don't have any, you know.
I get you.
You just get up in the morning and do what you have to do, and I'm talking about electioneering now, and you just become, you know, it just becomes your day's work, and I've done it before in a way, Fergus. You know, I campaigned in 3 referendums in the last decade: the children referendum of 2012, the so-called marriage referendum of 2015, and the 8th Amendment referendum of 2015 and 18 was the last one. So I kind of, you know, in a certain sense, know what it's about. I mean, I've done you know, parts of it before.
You're no stranger to the doorsteps.
Well, actually, I am, because I never did that part of it. And I'm not doing it now either, because I actually think that people are sick and tired of people coming to their doors looking for votes. My objective is to let people know I'm running. That's my sole objective, you know, to send out a signal that I'm actually on the paper, and if you look for me, you'll find me, and you can then decide what to do about that. And after that, so I mean, I could, I suppose, do that by going door to door, but on the one hand, I'm not entirely sure that, you know, in terms of time, it's the most productive way, given that we have a very short campaign.
Yes.
And also that I think that people are really have it up to here with politics, and they don't seem to feel they have many options in this election. And, you know, they haven't. In terms of governmental options, they don't have any options at all. It's the same thing, because we're basically voting out. We've had for the last 4 years, one major party in government and the other major party outside cheering it on and supporting it in actually everything. So, you know, it's just musical chairs. And at that level of choosing a government, you know, like, I think people must be totally cheesed off and bored, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was quite a low turnout this time.
Interesting.
So what I'm doing is I'm kind of offering people a choice on the margins, to give them a voice of opposition, which we've been lacking sorely for the last decade at least, and maybe a lot more longer, 2 decades if you consider the Celtic Tiger and the failure of any voices to emerge in time there to give us the warning we'd so desperately would have needed had we had it. And so I'm now, and I'm just saying, you know, I'm somebody. One of the things I can lay claim to is that I'm not easily silenced.
No, that's for sure.
And so, you know, if you want somebody who's, you know, prepared to say things that are unpalatable and unpopular and you know, have consequences for you, you know, particularly nowadays in your personal life and so on, I'm still prepared to do that. And I'm not going to be shouted down, and I'm going to keep doing it. So that's kind of vital, I think, for democracy right now. It's possibly more vital in a strange way than government is, given the way things have developed.
I want to pick up on that a little bit, and I want to look at 2 strains of John Waters, I suppose. And I want to quote here something you wrote in First Things, because I think you're a wonderful writer, and I think a lot of people think that too. So you said in 2018, I think it was, on Thursday, I had a strange sense that the day had the tenor of a Holy Saturday, a day lifted out of history, except that here, history seemed to have gone into reverse. The resurrection behind, Calvary in front. On Friday, the Irish people climbed Calvary backwards in the name of progress. If you would like to visit a place where the symptoms of the sickness of our time are found near their furthest limits, Come to Ireland. Here you will see a civilization in free fall, seeking with every breath to deny the existence of a higher authority, a people that has now sentenced itself not to look upon the cross of Christ, lest it be haunted by his rage and sorrow. Today, Ireland dances on the graves of little children. It is a country where freedom means the right to do just about anything you please without risk of consequences. So that, taken at face value, is really, really well written, whether it's right or it's wrong, okay, in my opinion. And there are a number of people that I've met who really admire your wisdom and your conviction and your talent, really, and they think you bring great gifts. But then they see you beside Gemma O'Doherty and beside what's his name? Justin Barrett, is that his name?
Yes.
And for me, I find that a little bit, and I don't want to use this alarmist word, but I find that troubling, because there's a number of problems I would have with the two of them. So what do you think about that? And do you think that you are perhaps alienating yourself further as a result of who you are standing beside on platforms and at venues and things like that?
Well, in the first place, Fergus, you know, I cannot get up in the morning and decide what I do on the basis of who or how many people I might alienate. If that's the primary objective, then I'm going to avoid saying certain things that might need saying, and I'm going to retreat into something like careerism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not a careerist. I never considered myself a careerist, even when I had a career. When I was a journalist in Ireland, I didn't consider it a career. I considered it a vocation. And I considered that its primary purpose was to tell the truth under every circumstance, and to acknowledge problems when they were there, and
yes,
to try to resolve them. And that's kind of both what, you know, allowed me to become successful as a writer, and also what allowed me to become attacked when the time came, and viciously driven out of journalism by people who might, by some people, be called my colleagues. So that's the first thing. I don't see myself that is, you know, whether or not I alienate people is not my business. I don't care. People, you know, just as a by the by on that, you know, people refer to me as a contrarian and a controversialist. Well, you know, those very ideas presuppose something that is actually completely nonsensical. It is that there is only one possible way of seeing everything, and anybody who deviates from that is only doing it for some kind of vexatious reasons or whatever, to get attention or something like that. It's actually possible, it is not, that the majority of people may sometimes be wrong. And that's the job of a journalist, in my view, or any kind of, shall we say, intellectual voice or cultural voice, whether they be a playwright, a poet, a writer, a journalist, any kind of novelist, you name it, artist, painter, musician, in a sense.
Fine.
So the second thing, to come to the two people you mentioned, I mean, yes. You see, with all due respect, Fergus, I think you're simply replicating a prejudice which has been generated out of media who are themselves corrupted.
Maybe I am. I have some examples for you here. And
well, can we deal with the question first? I mean, we can come so we can talk about that. But you see, it's very interesting. I mean, we were in Balbriggan last night. Now, as it happened, yes, the two people you mentioned were supposed to be on the bill with me. One of them didn't make it.
I heard that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see, this is interesting. Here we had a political meeting. It is in the course of an election. Two of the people involved were candidates. One was the leader of a party which has many candidates, I think at least a dozen, in the country. And a mob of thugs congregated around the entrance to the building in which the meeting was due to take place, menacing and threatening. The national broadcaster was there, but seeing the mob of thugs, decided that wouldn't look so good and went away. They didn't broadcast anything. The Garda Síochána arrived, two of them, two in the beginning, totally ineffectual, and were pretty much in cahoots with the mob outside the gate. I came there with my wife. I parked my car and I walked to the entrance. And on the way, I was assaulted by an individual who refused to let me pass and kept pushing his face into mine and uttering obscenities. The meeting went ahead thanks to Gemma O'Doherty's fortitude. And I'll come back to that. But there was no thanks on Garda Síochána, and there was no thanks to the press. Now, this is really where we need to focus, Fergus, not on the titbits put out by a malevolent press who are deeply shamed.
Well, John.
Deeply shamed, Fergus, by the behaviour, by the actions of Gemma O'Doherty, because she has shown them up for what they are. Cowards, corrupt cowards, for the greater part. Secondly, I will say this, because I don't back away from saying what I believe.
I know you don't, and I respect that.
Gemma O'Doherty is one of the finest people I have ever encountered in my life. She is brave, she is courageous, she is outspoken, she is direct, she is absolutely fearless.
She's a conspiracy theorist, isn't she?
What does that mean?
She, for example, the Phoenix wrote on the 21st of March.
The Phoenix? Fergus,
let me quote you this.
Please. I refuse to answer anything that is in the Phoenix. It is an abominable rag.
Really?
Obscene rag. Yes.
Well, what did she say? She's quoted as
anything that's in the Phoenix. The Phoenix published 3 years ago a tirade of lies about me.
Well, that's not right.
Well, no. So I don't trust anything. I don't want anything to do with the Phoenix. I don't want to discuss the Phoenix.
But John,
abominable rag. I'm talking about a woman who has actually nothing to gain by taking positions that she's taking. She's risking her life, her happiness, her security in a country in which democracy and the rule of law have collapsed in order to save her country from serious danger. This woman should be a heroine in this country. Instead, she is being denigrated by the whisperings of bad journalists. I refuse to listen to any of this gibberish. I am absolutely sick of it, Fergus. It is absolutely outrageous that they are allowed to do this. People who are actually so cowardly now, they just get behind the most powerful entities. Whether it be the government,
I'm not doing that.
Whether it be the LGBT goons, whether it be now the thugs we saw last night.
I'm not doing that.
But Fergus, I was there and I'm telling you what happened.
I know, but I'm quoting a quote of Gemma O'Doherty where she said that the Christchurch horror, in quotes, has all the hallmarks of a classic false flag operation, a la 9/11, a professional job.
What has that got to do with me? What has got to do with
the public are no longer fooled.
It has. I mean,
you're responsible. Will you let me finish the point? You're not responsible for what comes out of her mouth, but you're responsible for your decision to meet with her and to be on the same.
Fergus, you're saying to me that the corrupt news journalists of Ireland will be allowed to decide who I associate with? No.
That's your decision.
It is my decision, and I
think you are unwise to.
This is what people tell. Yeah. Well, I can tell you that the people in general who tell me these things are not fit to shine Gemma O'Doherty's shoes. So I would be one of them. I'm not saying you are, but I'm just telling you, you shouldn't listen to these people. Try and think these things through for yourself. Why don't you come along to one of Gemma O'Doherty's meetings one night and listen? I would love to. Why don't you tune into some of her broadcasts on YouTube?
I watched a lot of your conversation with her last night, and I very much enjoyed your contribution. She herself, and this has nothing to do with the Phoenix or no one, she tweeted, she had a video on YouTube which was removed where she called the September 11 attacks scripted.
Last night?
No.
No, she didn't.
She didn't say that last night.
No, she didn't.
So do you not think she has the responsibility to tell the truth?
Well, you better take that up with Gemma. But I'm talking about. I've been on platforms, all kinds of people who have all kinds of different views to mine. That's the whole point of politics. That's the whole point of discussions.
Mm-hmm.
If everybody had the same opinions about everything, there would be no point in us having any conversations, including this one.
I agree with it.
So this is the point of journalism. And when did journalism cease to be about having conversations from different perspectives, exploring different perspectives, putting forward information, theories, ideas from different perspectives? When did it cease to be that and become the policing of people's thoughts? By what authority did journalists begin to become the public prosecutors of our culture?
You would say by none.
By none. They have no authority. They have no authority, whether it be moral or otherwise.
And they have a responsibility.
Journalism is a deeply corrupt profession in Ireland. They have responsibility, but they have long since failed to discharge it. They have abrogated and abdicated their role as the fourth estate in this country. That is why people like Gemma O'Doherty have had to step forward and do the job that they have failed to do. And she is one woman working alone, very bravely. Self-sacrifice doesn't get it.
But she doesn't tell the truth.
Yes, she does. To the best of her. Well, she tells the truth as she knows it, as she sees it. And that's all we can ask for. And that's all I do. And that's all anybody can do. So, this is just another attempt by journalists to assess. And sadly, Fergus, you've fallen into the trap of listening to these people, of carrying on their whispers. I'm not interested in their whispers. I am interested in discussing real issues.
So am I.
And as far as I'm concerned, Gemma O'Doherty is a fine woman, a very brave woman, a very intelligent woman, and a woman of great devotion to the truth.
Okay, that's your view, and I have a different one, and I hope to continue this conversation.
We can certainly continue the conversation, Fergus, but I would seriously suggest to you, and I'm not being patronising, I hope.
I know you're not.
I would seriously suggest to you that you actually start to look at some of the people who are doing this whispering and ask yourself, what are their motivations?
I'm looking at her Twitter account, but again, I don't want to get caught up purely on Gemma O'Doherty.
But don't you find it strange or wrong or something? I don't know.
I find it upsetting.
But are you not disturbed by the fact that you're simply repeating the same thing that's in the Star and the Sun and the Irish?
I don't read those papers. I barely read anything.
By some process of osmosis or otherwise, you end up taking the same position as they have. And that's the sad situation I have to say to you, Fergus, to be in on any issue. Please,
John, a lot of people would write you off, and I don't do that. So I think I would set myself and say,
I've been written off many times, Fergus, and many times in my life, and I'm still alive.
And I want to talk to you. That's why I'm talking to you today.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'm happy to talk to you. And by the way, the tone of our conversation for the last few minutes has been heated. That's just the way things are. That's the way I am. And so there's nothing personal in that. I hope you understand that. Yeah. I do not in any way bear grudges against people. It's other people who bear grudges against me because I tell them the truth, or the truth at least as I see it. And I don't have any resentment about anything you're asking, but I'm just answering you directly as I've always done. That's all.
Okay.
So let's continue.
I as you are well aware, you have a reputation of expressing your views forthrightly, and I wanted to ask you about journalists on the other side of the political game, let's say, who are quite vocal in their views, and I don't think you would want to deny them of their right to express themselves, but there's a deeper, seemingly more systemic problem where there isn't a fair competition within the Irish media between one side and another. So where, let's say, you have an individual journalist, I'm just going to use the name of Fintan O'Toole. He expresses his writings and you express yours, but there seems to be an awful lot more Fintan O'Tooles than there are John Waterses. So can you talk to me a little bit about why do you think that is, and why do you think there is such a, what you might see as a mismatch on the pitch? Like it's not 15 against 15.
You're talking, Fergus, about viewpoint, I guess, or whatever you might call it, position, ideology, that kind of thing.
A balance of sides within Irish discussion. Why do we have that?
Oh yeah, well, it's a big question, Fergus, and I mean it's one I've addressed many times for the last 30 years, and because I've been aware of it for a very long time. but it has become deeply acute now in recent years. I mean, it is now actually, fatal to have a different view professionally, as I've discovered. Um, it's complicated. I mean, it has got to do with the fact that, journalists tend to converge around certain ideas, and journalism at any given moment, or indeed culture and society at any given moment, tend to converge around certain ideas, which then through time can be open to question, perhaps. But in the short term, they're not necessarily, or even in the medium term, they're not. And they're unassailable, unquestionable. And therefore, you see, the nature of journalism is that, I found this from the very beginning when I went into the Irish Times, because I had this kind of, what I now realize was a deeply naive idea coming up from the west of Ireland that, wow, to work in the Dublin media would be such a wonderful thing. And, I got a job in hot press and I couldn't believe it. And I was working on Wicklow Street, like 100 yards from Grafton Street. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. And then, I worked my way into various other institutions in the Irish media, finally into the Irish Times. And if you had said to me when I was down driving my mail car in Roscommon and Mayo, maybe around the early 80s, John, you're going to end up in the Irish Times, I would have said you're crazy.
Yes. And
then I did. And I would have thought then, if you were to say, well, what would it be like, John? What do you think it would be like? I would have said, well, that's going to be such an amazing thing because you have all these different minds, these different thinkers, these different opinions, and they're going to be jostling for space. And, so that I could sort of had this kind of fantasy of a place where people would be kind of stopping to argue in the corridors and between the desks about their different viewpoints in friendly fashion, like we're doing now, I hope.
Yes.
And maybe sometimes getting a bit heated, as we are sometimes, but that's no harm. That's the way it is. If you believe passionately in things, then you're going to kind of always, follow that passion.
Mm-hmm.
To its kind of, not hopefully its ultimate direct destination or logic, but certainly a long way. And so, but then when I arrived, I found something entirely different. I mean, I had, by definition, just by the nature of who I was and the experience I'd had, I hadn't been to university. I'd done all kinds of ordinary jobs. I got into journalism, as it were, by accident, and I kind of had a different perspective on the world, which is kind of, in a certain sense, replicated now, or somewhat ironically, in the world in general, if you think about it like that. That there is that divide now in America and in Europe, between those who have, lived their lives by engaging directly with the world, and those who have lived their lives academically, if you like, or virtually
through an iPhone.
Yeah, and so I was, and I thought, well, they're going to disagree with me about a lot of the things I think, but they're going to be my friends, and they're going to, But I found the direct opposite. They didn't want to be my friends. They want to be my enemies. Mm. They want to excoriate me. They wanted to report me to the editor for all kinds of crimes.
Was this from the beginning?
Yes, pretty much from the beginning. Not for the things that were to happen later. I mean, in the very early days, it was things like nationalism. Coming from the west of Ireland, you see, I had a different exposure to the whole question, the national question, than say somebody in Dublin, and I brought those ideas with me, and it was different to the northern experience as well. But there were some things in common, and I was, I would say, I won't say that I was profoundly nationalistic. That isn't the point. I was profoundly attached to the national ideal and to its history and to its heroism. And to me, Pearse was the greatest hero in Irish history. And I looked up to him tremendously, and I had read everything he'd written many times, and still do read it very frequently. And I wrote about this, and I found, I was being disapproved of for this. And then I wrote against the EU, which I had a strong conviction about going back, right back to the early 70s when we started to go to negotiate our entry. And my father was dead set against it. And I was to go around with him in the van and hear these debates and became convinced that he was right. I mean, he was right about a hell of a lot of things. So again, and I mean, like in the Irish Times, this was completely, an abomination. I thought they would welcome the idea of having one different voice, but that was not that was not the reality. They tried to talk me out of it. I mean, I remember one time being at a meeting in the RDS during the '92 Maastricht Treaty referendum debate. And there was supposed to be a meeting on which was all the different sides would get together and have a debate. When I got there was only one side, and there was nobody raising any questions at all. And it was all the pro-European, pro-Maastricht people. And so I from the audience, decided I would, take the place of those who weren't there and start asking questions, which I did quite, and we had quite an enjoyable, boisterous afternoon. Peter Sutherland, I remember, was there that day, and Princius de Rossa and people like that. And when I was leaving, a senior editor from the Irish Times offered me a lift back. Now, this guy wouldn't give me the time of day normally, but he offered me a lift back to the office.
Okay.
And on the way back in the car, he said, "John," he says, I have something very serious to say to you. He said, I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "The editor is deeply concerned about the things you're writing. He thinks that you're doing yourself no favors." This is a great phase of these people who are always giving you advice about what you should write and what you shouldn't write. You're doing yourself no favors. A bit like what you're telling me about Gemma O'Doherty. I'm doing myself no favors. I'm not in the business of doing myself favors. I'm in the business of doing the favors to the truth where I can. So I said to this gentleman, I said, "Well, thank you very much for the lift, but I think I'll get out now." And that was the end of the conversation. You see, these people will talk till the cows come home about freedom of expression and the right to have your opinion. And I may not agree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say this, that, or the other. Well, they won't. They won't even defend your right to the end of the road. Mm-hmm. So this has been my experience in the Irish Times from the beginning. So I became a lone wolf in the Irish Times. Now, I was very fortunate, Fergus, in a strange way, that coincidentally with joining the Times, something else happened in my life that was very dramatic. There were a number of things that converged. I think I talked to you before about several of them. And I just kind of, one of them was going to Prague and really coming to the end of my socialist.
I want you to tell that story. You didn't tell me that story before, but I've heard you tell it. I like that anecdote.
Okay. Well, then there were two things. Sorry, my headpiece in my deaf ear is falling out. I just like it for balance. It's aesthetically better, I think. Okay, well, there are these two things which happened in 1990. One was almost the first job. I think the first job I got when I went to the Irish Times. In fact, I think I made it a condition of joining was that I'd be allowed to go to Prague to write about the first free elections after '89, after the revolution. And that was an amazing experience. And there's a story, a very weird and wonderful story about the revolution and how it started in Prague. And the story is that it was actually started by the KGB. And I think that is true. I think this is actually a true story. It sounds fantastic, but it's actually very, all the facts seem to fit. There was a demonstration of students from a graveyard at the grave of a young man who had died in 1968, and in the invasion of the Russian tanks, which is this memorable time when the tanks came into Prague, and the students were throwing flowers in front of the tanks, and the tanks were rolling over the flowers. And Alexander Dubček, the president, who was now shamed in this situation by the arrival of the tanks, he said this memory, which I wrote a song about, which got me into the terrible trouble of ending up last in Eurovision. But however, it was, again, like a lot of things in my life, I don't mind losing. I don't mind even coming last, so long as I make the best shot at it. But the line was, that Dubček said, he says, "They may crush the flowers, but they cannot stop the spring." And he was right. The spring took another 21 years, but it came. And that was what my song was about. But I met in Prague that time in 1990 a man called Ivan Shrek, who had a house off Narodny Street, an apartment, which is Narodny Street was the street that the students were coming back down from the cemetery. And they planned the KGB. What the way it worked was that Gorbachev was concerned that the government in the communist regime in Prague was so hardline. Remember, Gorbachev was trying to soften it and create a kind of version of socialism with a human face. And the plan then was that they would try to bring down the existing communist regime in Prague and replace it with a softer one. And they had their puppet president in place, ready. They'd done a deal with him to step in once the existing Hasek, I think was the guy's name. I can't remember exactly maybe the sequence, but I think it was Hasek. And so the plan was that the police would be ordered to attack the students' march as it came down Rodney Street. And the students would be infiltrated by a KGB agent. And the man's name was Michael Schmidt. And the police would attack. And in the midst of this, then Michael Schmidt would lie down, would fall to the ground and pretend to be dead. And when the word would go out around Prague that a student had been killed by the police, then it was calculated that the people would, which was already some precedent for, would storm onto the streets.
Yes.
And they did. 1 million people came onto the streets of Prague immediately and gathered in Wenceslas Square. And Havel spoke to them there.
Yes.
And that was the start of the revolution. And the thing was that at that moment when the puppet was supposed to step in, the regime was had to capsize, but the puppet refused to honor the agreement he'd made with Gorbachev, and so Havel became president. Mm-hmm. But the point is that at the point where Michael Schmidt was alleged to have fallen, the residents of Prague, the citizens, built an altar in memory of the dead student, as they believed. He wasn't dead; he was just pretending. But they thought he was dead, and his body was taken away, or he was taken away on a stretcher. And the story was carried through to the final degree. And the altar was there, and people, every passersby would bring, it's a tradition in Eastern Europe, they would bring candles and light them and leave them there. And after a day or so, the wax, melting wax, began to flow onto the side, off the sidewalk, onto the roadway, blocking the drains, and so on and so on. And my friend Ivan Freck was given the job of cleaning up the candle wax every morning, and he got he had this idea. Then he got these busts of the communist dictators, Lenin, Stalin, and Klement Gottwald, who was the big tyrant in Czechoslovakia in those years, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that period. And he made these, out of these busts, he made molds, and out of the molds he made candles.
Yes. In
the shape of the heads of these tyrants. And he called them Gottwalds after Klement Gottwald. They were given the generic name of Gottwalds because they have a very ironic sense of humor, the Czech, very funny people, in a very way that's very, very close to the Irish sense of irony in some ways, you know. And but anyway, in the meantime, Ivan and I were having these arguments all the time about politics. And you see, I was coming from an Irish soft left position.
Yes.
And arguing for, socialism and saying that, it had really been well intentioned, but it had been waylaid by evil men type of thing. That was my general thesis. And he wasn't agreeing with this at all, and there was no evidence at all of anything other than evil men in his country, and or in any of the other countries that he knew of. And so I wasn't really buying this, and we were having all these arguments. Very, again, Fergus, and this is really an interesting theme of the evening, that we could have these disagreements without hating each other, or without going, crazy. I seem to go crazy sometimes. I have to admit, my wife is constantly telling me to calm the hell down, and I am hot-headed, but there is no malice in any of my reactions. I don't think I've ever, for my part, fallen out with somebody I was in a debate with in my life. I always, some of the strongest arguments, people like Nell McCafferty, the great Irish feminist, we used to be tearing lumps out of each other on TV. And 20 minutes later, we'll be standing out in the corridor having a great laugh together, Not that we were, being cynical about the issues we were discussing. We weren't, but that we actually could transcend those and see each other as human beings. This is something that's missing now from our culture. To come back to Prague. So anyway, on the final day, when I was going back to Dublin, Ivan accompanied me in the cab to the airport. And on his knee, he had a cardboard box. And I asked him, well, what have you got in the box, Ivan? And he said, you will find out. So we arrived at the airport, and he was carrying the box, and he came in with me into the departure lounge and up to the departure gate. And then he formally presented me with the box, and he opened it up. And then there was about 6 or 8 or whatever of these Gottwalds, big ones, and also some small ones that he had done as well. And he says, you must take to Ireland the heads of the socialist murderers. And I thought to myself, my goodness, phew. I get it. I get it. Something about that sentence, something unequivocal, something final, something, that was the final, that was the punchline in all of our arguments.
Defining.
Yes. And that changed my entire thinking, because when I went home, I could never get that out of my head again, that line. I can't get it out of my head, that this was not
Are you still in touch with that man?
No.
Is he still alive?
He's about the same age as me. I think he would be, well, I presume, mind you, I'm not so young anymore, so you never know. But I think he is, yeah, as far as I know. I'd love to go back and meet him. I have been back several times, and I went looking for him, but he's no longer in the apartment he was in, and I don't have a number for him. And but who knows? I may go back again, and the next time maybe we will meet. He has had a huge effect on me. So that was one event that happened in 1990. The second event was that I stopped drinking. And I did that actually about a month after I came back from Prague, because I was still drinking when I was there with Ivan. We're having a few beers when we were having the argument. But I had begun to realize over the previous 2 years that I had a problem with drink. And I decided that I was going to deal with it by no longer drinking, by stopping. And I stopped on the 29th of July in 1990, I stopped. And I haven't had a drink since.
Really?
So it'll be, it'll be 30 years this year. And that was a major thing for me, Fergus, in my journalistic life. Because within a few months of that, I became a columnist at the Irish Times. And if I had become a columnist in the Irish Times, I believe, and had continued drinking, I would have been a terrible columnist. Because I would have been writing other people's opinions all the time. Because that's what happens in journalism, that ideas become policed into a kind of a pancake shape, they're flattened down and everybody has the same opinions.
You needed your complete sobriety to fight that.
Yeah, because the pub was a central place. Maybe it's not so much now. I think that, the tradition of journalists and drink is not as strong as it was. I mean,
one time. You just mean the social aspect then, as opposed to the actual substance?
Is that what you mean? Yes, I do. The journalists used to meet a lot in pubs. And when I was a young journalist, when I was editor of In Dublin, for example, and McGill and those magazines, we had a wonderful time, back in the 80s. But we spent a hell of a lot of time in pubs, and I looking back on that experience, I realized that it was actually quite dangerous. We were all of one mind anyway, but, and at the time, and I don't. Maybe that was a necessary and maybe even a good thing. I don't know. We did some good stuff, and that was a great time for journalism. That was that was the period of what you might call the Irish counterculture, when Irish journalism, through Hot Press and in Dublin and McGill and in Bernia and other publications started to create a different voice in the society, which kind of was so different from what had come before, what had existed before, because journalism up to that point was, generally speaking, very dull, and probably has unleashed a hell of a lot of stuff into going up to the moment, which now I suppose you have to look back and say that it was actually not entirely a great idea after all, because some of it is absolutely awful. But that's, I suppose, inevitable. Our journalism, I suppose, had some effect, because a lot of what we were doing was being copied by the mainstream press in diluted form. But I suppose there were other influences as well, like the British tabloids and so on, which kind of came more around the same time. But anyway, but going back to that point, that was the social, yes, is one aspect. But the same thing carries through into what they call conferences. In the Irish Times, they never had meetings; they always had conferences. And they were like, different kinds of ones. There would be news conference, and there would be a features conference. And then the features conference was a weekly event, and everybody went to that. And for the first 6 months in the Irish Times, I went to every single one, until I realized that it was a complete charade. Like, it was like just people reading out lists, agreeing with each other's opinions, and rubbishing anybody that they didn't agree with, or sneering at them. And I just got bored and tired of all this, so I just decided to stay at home, and I didn't go back then ever. And I think that didn't really endear me to my colleagues so much. But no. I felt that I believe the independent mindedness of the journalist is the most important thing.
Yes.
There are two most important things that you bring as a journalist, before anything: your subjectivity, your unique subjectivity, that nobody else in history or in time has the same experience as you have.
Some would say objectivity, wouldn't they? Some would actually say objectivity, quite the opposite of what you're saying.
Ah, yes.
That you have to be objective.
That's a very interesting question. Yes, they would, and I think that you see, this is a big discussion as well. There's no such thing as objectivity. John Healy, the great journalist from Charlestown, used to say, "Objectivity is in heaven."
Not very nihilistic.
No, it's not. You see, the point is that if you are aware, journalism is a very imperfect science, as it were, and the important thing is to be aware of your biases and prejudices.
Okay.
And also, as an editor, it's very important that you're aware of the biases and prejudices of your journalists. I mean, you see, some of the best journalists I've ever met have been journalists of extreme bias.
Like Vincent Brown would be a good example, maybe.
A very good example, yes. I mean, yes. And also people like, people that I worked with years ago. There was a wonderful journalist called Derek Dunn, who died very young. He was a great friend of mine, and he worked with me in Dublin, and to some extent in McGill as well. But he was driven by certain ideas. He was a great nationalist. He was a Republican, and he wrote a book with Jean Kerrigan called "Round Up the Usual Suspects" about Nicky Kelly and the Salons train robbery. And that was a notorious case that happened back in the 80s of wrongful imprisonment. And Derek Dunn, undoubtedly, in my opinion, undoubtedly, I would say, full stop, was responsible for Nicky Kelly being released from jail. Because he actually went and he slept on Vincent Brown's doorstep for weeks on end, until he had convinced him that he should cover this story, that he said it was a shocking injustice. And out of that came all that followed. But Derek was, of course, deeply biased, hugely passionate, and one-sided in his approach to journalism. Not entirely. That's possibly not fair, because the great thing about a passionate journalist is when they meet people, very often, no matter what their opinions are, they become attached to them. They like them. I mean, Derek would interview somebody he completely disagreed with, and end up giving the most interesting insight into this person, that somebody else might not see into. So
I might not want to be willing to see.
Yeah. So you see, so I don't think objectivity. You see, the thing about it is the big lie of objectivity is what allows a lot of bad journalism to hide itself from scrutiny. Any newspaper, any day of the week, Fergus, if you look at the front page of it, and there'll be maybe half a dozen stories there with different headlines, different sizes of headlines, different sizes of photographs, and so on. All of that involves a series of decisions which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with an objective sense of what happened yesterday. The decisions reflect far more the biases and prejudices of those who make the choices, whether that be the photograph or the headline, the size of the headline, the content of the headline. The choice of stories. The choice of stories in the first place is something that is not objective of its nature.
But shouldn't it strive to be, John? Like in say 50 years ago, wouldn't it have been more, to use that word, wouldn't it have appeared more objective? Do you not think? Like, was there not a time before when, you could trust the Irish Times in your view?
I don't think you can necessarily say that lack of objectivity and distrust go together. It doesn't necessarily follow like that at all. I mean, you see, the absence of objectivity, if you're aware of it and are trying to moderate it and make it visible.
What about Village? Would that be a good example then? Because they are not objective, as in they take a stance, but...
Sorry, I missed the word you said there. What word did you say?
Village magazine, would that be an example?
I don't know.
The point, I'm just making the point, like, even though they're not covering everything from a completely, let's say, neutral standpoint, at least you might be able to trust them. That's only the point I'm making.
I wouldn't agree with that now.
Is there one example, John?
Okay, well, I mean, I do have something. I have written from time to time for Village under its various proprietors, including Vincent Brown. And I wrote for a long time when Vincent was editor, or an extended period anyway. And I always had the view about Village, and I've said this to Vincent very often, you know, because I advised him against launching it in the first place, because I said he would lose his shirt on it, and he did. And I also advised him that, you know, in general, if you're trying to sell a newspaper or a magazine to people, it's generally speaking a good idea not to be attacking your readers in every second article, because they don't like it. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, when you attack the very basis of people's, you know, way of life, their views, you are trying to preach to them about things that they have already, you know, a particular view on, and you're not making any concession towards that view. I think eventually people get sick of it. That's just my view. To go back to the general point, I mean, Vincent, as I said, I've agreed with you about Vincent. He was an exceptional force of nature in Irish journalism for certain, and you know, he and I have had our ups and downs. We continue to be on friendly terms despite all of our differences. Again,
yes,
the old team. You know, I mean, we had some terrible rows, but we are friends now, as you know, two old fellows meeting in the park, but the question of objectivity, John Healy again used to say, fairness is a better word.
Okay.
Be fair.
I like that.
Yeah, like, you see, I think that's the thing. If you actually sit around a table with people and you begin to get the feeling that they're trying to get somebody, and that person maybe has another side to them than the side that they're seeing or want to see, then it's your job to step forward and say at the table, well, actually, I know this guy, or I've heard that, by the way, he's this. Like, let me tell you an example in my own case, which is against myself. You're probably too young to remember this guy, but you would know his daughter. I think you might have actually interviewed his daughter very recently, Fergus, if I'm not mistaken.
Victoria White?
No, Des Hannafin.
Yeah, I did interview his daughter. Yeah, Mary Hannafin.
Yeah. Well, no, this is an example. Because again, going back to the Maastricht Treaty, there was an aspect of the Maastricht Treaty in Ireland which was unique, which was that there was a protocol being added to the treaty for Ireland in relation to abortion. So that was being fought in a parallel campaign, as it were, alongside the main question, or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe that was the main question. But anyway, and at the time, I was kind of, I won't say I was neutral on the pro-life issue, but I was more interested in the Maastricht thing. I wasn't visible, to be honest, about, and I should have been, but I wasn't visible. I was. Sorry
to stop. Just to clarify, are you saying that the treaty and the abortion agenda were linked? Is that it?
Yeah, they were the same question. They were just on the ballot paper together. You know, okay. The protocol was being attached to the Maastricht Treaty at the request of the Irish government, and we were voting on this.
What protocol was that?
It was to do with abortion, that it was a guarantee that nothing in European law would be used to overturn the Irish ban on abortion.
Oh, okay.
That's an ironic one, isn't it? Anyway, it just shows you, you know. But anyway, I mean, how would I describe my position? I mean, this was 1992. I wasn't that long in the Irish Times, a couple of years, and I was probably about 6 or 7 years out of hot press and that whole thing. And I'd been editor of McGill in 1988, so I was still on that kind of left of the spectrum. And we're a couple of years on from 1990, so I was beginning to change my entire outlook on things, on a lot of things, but I wasn't, I had a sense, going back, and you'll pick this thing up in my book, Driving at the Crossroads, that, I remember that 83 period when I was kind of certainly not, whereas I wasn't in favor of abortion, I wasn't enamored of the pro-life movement in general, or there was groups like Spuck and those people. And I just I bought into, a bit like I'm accusing you of, Fergus, of the other people's ideas about things. And I developed or acquired prejudices that were not my own.
Yes.
And started to regurgitate them for the benefit, for the consumption of a gallery, that there's some invisible gallery that I sensed to be out there. Yeah. And again, I'm admitting now that I was at an early stage in beginning to interrogate myself about all this. But in the course of on the day of the count, I was asked by the Irish Times on the newsroom at that point. I was a reporter, and I was sent down by the news desk to spend the day with Des Hannafin, a man that I would probably have been full of prejudice about.
Yes.
And he blew me away. I found him one of the most extraordinary presences I'd ever encountered, because not alone was his conviction rock solid, but he was an extraordinarily funny man.
Yeah.
And he brought me around the area, and he showed me all the various places he had worked, and he told me the whole history of his life, and it was absolutely spellbinding. And he was an absolutely beautiful man. I remember him, and he was on the phone at one point and waiting for results, and he was kind of not optimistic, but then he got bad news. But instead of actually bemoaning it, he started to dance around the floor, literally dance around the floor. And he was kind of a little bit crazy, in that way that is very, very attractive and beguiling. And then I had an old banger of the car. I think there were about 2 of them. What was it called? A Toyota Tercel. I think there had been 3 of them that were made altogether, and I ended up with one of them. They were terrible cars. It was a real banger, a rust bucket. And Destin found that he had to go to Dublin. And I said, well, I'm going back to Dublin. And he said, do you want a lift? Not thinking it through. And because I was enjoying his company so much, and we continued, and he told me more and more stories about his life.
Yeah.
And then when we got to Dublin, he had to go to the hotel there. What's the hotel off Grafton Street there? That I can't remember now. It's in a little bit off the street, and that's where he was meeting with some people. And so I drove in, and you could drive up Grafton Street at that point, and I drove into this place. And when I got around the corner and headed towards the front door of the hotel, I realized there was about 50 journalists waiting for Des.
Wow. And
I was thinking, they're going to think I'm a friend of Des. They're going to think I'm with this guy. Oh, what will this do for my credibility? My street cred will be shot to pieces. I was having these kind of thoughts in a nanosecond.
I get you.
As I was driving up. And then a second later, I said to myself, I don't care. This guy is better than any of them.
I get you.
That's what I'm talking about. That you actually have the openness to actually see change in your perception of the world as you're looking at it. That's what a great journalist, I'm not saying I'm a great journalist, but that's what a great journalist cannot be a great journalist without that quality. Mm. And that's unfortunately what's happened to journalism. That openness is gone. And everybody's now is an activist of some kind or another. And there's a difference between an activist and what I was talking about earlier, which is my friend Derek Dunn, who was a passionate activist in a certain sense, in that he was trying to get certain things and make certain cases. He was acting alone. He wasn't part of a wave, a movement. As soon as a wave or a movement started, Derek would be gone, because he said, well, they'll be able to do the job. No, you don't need a journalist to do this, right? he would move on then to another cause. Mm. You see, that's the difference. Whereas now they gather in with the mob. They join in and they attack the enemies of the mob and silence them. This is, I think, the great problem, But the question of objectivity is I think,
That's an interesting one.
Fairness is better.
Okay, I am gonna ask you a little bit about something. The party is anti-corruption Ireland. Is that a party or just an alliance, or what is it?
Well, it's a fledgling movement, I guess you would call it. It's not actually formally a political party as such as yet. It hasn't been registered, and as such, on the ballot paper, and this is purely technicality, but it's the case, I'll be described as non-party.
Okay.
Anti-corruption Ireland won't be mentioned. There's nothing to that other than the fact that the party has not been registered yet. And the reason for that, by the way, is, as I understand it, that there are several ways you can do this. I think the two main ones are you have to collect a huge number of signatures, is one, or else you can get somebody elected and then you're automatically registered. So it's just a bit of a bureaucratic hassle to actually do it the first way. And I think that's the only reason it hasn't been done.
For the purposes of our discussion, let's just kind of call it a party. I just want a word to use. Let's call it a party. So the Anti-Corruption Ireland and the National Party in Ireland, a fundamental core pillar of the policies of both groups is a resistance to immigration, and what is it fair to say you would see as a replacement of the Irish people on the island of Ireland?
Well, I'd slightly correct you there. It's not a resistance to immigration, it's a resistance to mass immigration into Ireland without consultation with the people.
Okay, so
it's a more subtle point. There's always been people coming to Ireland, and they've always been welcomed, and we've had all kinds of people coming to work here and live here and so on. And I certainly have no issue whatsoever with the free movement of people. This is a different category, whereby over the last 20 years, a totally disproportionate number of people have been brought into our country by stealth, under different headings, at a time when huge number, almost equivalent numbers of our own people had been leaving, and I think that there's something seriously wrong about that.
Don't you, as a Christian, or regardless of your religious conviction, isn't there a call by Jesus and elsewhere in the Bible that you should love your neighbor regardless of who he or she is? Like, do you not see someone coming in as an equal and why? Yeah, why? What's the problem with this? And I'm not trying to paint you in a particular light. I'm just putting.
You're doing exactly what they always do. You see what you've said there is absolutely fine, but it's what you have done is taken the words of Jesus, which apply to a one-on-one encounter with another human being, and you've applied it to an ideological program which seeks to move, say, 500,000 people in. Jesus never said that you had to love 500,000 people. He said you love your neighbor. If I meet any color of person on the road and they need my help, I will give them that help, and I have done. You see, we'll come deeper into this, but
there's a distinction there. You say.
There's a huge distinction. There's a wonderful cardinal, an African cardinal called Robert Sarah, who has spoken about this precise thing. And if you want to check, people want to check him out, look him up on the web. He's written a book about, it's actually an extended interview with him. But he talks about the idea that he says that to use the Gospels in favor of mass migration is a false exegesis. It's completely a misuse of the Gospels, because under various headings, there's all kinds of distortions and lies being told about this, and false comparisons being made, for example, between his Irish history and what's happening now.
Moving to America and things like that.
Yeah. Well, you see, first of all, immigration is a bad thing for a country. We know this better than anybody else. When people
immigration with an E.
Yes. When people have to leave their country, it's a very bad thing. Like in the 1950s, like between 1945 and 1960, we lost 500,000 of our people. That's just before I was, just around the time I was born. They were still leaving. And the damage that has done to our country and its thought processes and its civilization is incalculable. And the same is true of Africa, which is what Cardinal Sarah is pointing out, that rather than actually seeking to suck these people out and use them basically as our servants in Europe, we should be helping them to build their country. And I agree with that. By the way, I'm not blowing my own trumpet. You see, people call. You see, this is really quite disturbing, Fergus, and bear with me for a moment because it's very important that I say one or two things about this. Last night in Balbriggan, I was walking up the street with my wife, and this guy coming down the street sees me coming. I wasn't taking any notice of him, but as I came upon him, he stood in front of me, and I thought, well, this can sometimes happen. I'm by the way, I'm slowing down my thoughts. This happened again in a nanosecond. I thought, oh, sorry, I stepped aside. Sometimes you go the wrong side of somebody and you bump into each other. So I stepped aside, and he stepped aside, and he started uttering obscenities to me and pushing his face into mine. And when I moved the other way, he would do the same thing. And he started calling me a racist and so on. Now, this is something you get all the time. And I got more of that later from, I would say, a pretty low level of individual, to be honest. That was what was there. They were pure thugs, right? And they were supported by the guards, which is a really sinister development in our
were you not protected by the guards too, in fairness?
I was inside before the guards got there. There was no guards there when I arrived, and they gave me no protection whatsoever.
Okay.
So, sorry, where was I there?
You said you too. Yeah, go
okay.
on.
No, you see, I really don't need to justify myself. But I will say this. Over the past 20 years, I've been to Africa on a number of occasions. I've been involved with developmental organizations. I've collected money for organizations. I've donated money to organizations. I've been to Africa many times and spoken to many, many people about their lives. I've written about it at great length. I've also written about the post-colonial history of Africa and the connections there are between Ireland and Africa in those terms, in cultural terms.
The wretched of the earth.
Yes. I've written at great length about Frantz Fanon, whom I regard as one of the great intellectuals who ever lived, one of the greatest. When you then have some moron, let's not be too delicate about it, calling you racist, on behalf of people who you cannot see, he's been sent out to do this, to promote an agenda against the Irish people, in my view, which they're afraid to open their mouths about. And I have one role in life, is to speak. That's my job. If I don't speak, I might as well die. If I don't write, I might as well die. So I'm not going to be intimidated by thugs. Whether they have uniforms on them or not, I don't care. So these are important questions. All I'm saying, all Gemma O'Doherty is saying, at bottom, why can we not have a conversation about these things? Why did we not have a conversation about things like this? Why do we not have a conversation about these things?
I think that's a valid question.
It is a valid.
All the questions you asked are valid, but again, I don't want to get
there are no buts. Sorry, Fergus. There are no buts.
John, there is a difference. She's tweeting things that are quite, I would say, maliciously directed at. Well,
maybe, Fergus, has it occurred to you that if there was an open conversation, she wouldn't need to bother tweeting anything? That she could.
I think that is no excuse to go into a butcher shop.
You're doing.
Hello, meat, John. Forget the context. Just to take that individual incident, to walk into the butcher shop, run by Muslims, and to demand pork and to say, where are the rashers and sausages? Regardless of the time and context that we're in, I think that is inexcusable. And to raise legitimate concerns about immigration is another thing entirely. And I think that's what you are capable of doing and are trying to do. And I see a difference between legitimate questions and going in and harassing Muslims.
Well, I wouldn't agree that it's harassing Muslims, and I don't think that if she were to go, or any journalist was to go in and challenge any Irish shopkeeper on any question, that journalists will be jumping in the same way. There's a certain kind of, I would call it infantilization of people coming into this country now by journalists in the interest of the agenda they're trying to promote.
What is infantilization, sir?
Well, it's basically they're treating them as less than adults. Okay. They're actually treating them as people who are incapable of speaking up for themselves. In my experience of being in Africa and talking to these people of any kind, of lots of different nationalities, they're well able to hold their own in a conversation. They're well able to argue their case. Very often you find that people who have, for example, lived in the country for a long time have a different view of mass migration than you might expect them to. They don't necessarily approve of it.
I see that in America, actually. I see that.
There's all kinds of subtleties. And the reason for that is, you see, this is not about racism at all. There's a number of strange paradoxes about the whole question of racism, the way it's bandied around now by imbeciles, really. Sometimes imbeciles, the useful idiots, but also by people cynically seeking to conceal what they're actually doing. It's a strange thing that we're told, for example, that there's no Irish race. That really races don't any longer exist, and yet we're guilty of racism. I'm not sure what they mean by racism. Racism is the assertion of superiority over another person or peoples,
or presumably someone else's inferiority, let's say.
Or indeed, yes, but there's no necessary. I don't see any examples of this before coming. Nobody's saying that. Nobody's saying that anybody who comes here for whatever reason is inferior, nor is anybody saying that I'm superior, they're superior. What they're saying is that for different reasons, we cannot accommodate huge numbers of people from other cultures in the way that they come. Can I
read you one more tweet?
No, I thought you wanted to interview me.
I do, but again, you are choosing to take her side, and she's on your side, and
yes, I do, because I have admiration for the courage she has shown in the face of enormous hostility, hatred. People talk about hate.
German, dump, little, gaslighting the Irish people with their multicultural version of the Ryans. Kidding no one, exclamation mark. Resist the great replacement wherever you can by giving this kip a wide berth. Hashtag shop Irish, hashtag buy Irish.
Is that supposed to be racist against Germans or something?
And, well, apparently there was a picture of, I think it was a black woman who was on a little banner, and she was apparently, again, you might doubt these claims, but abused, stemming from this attack by Gemma O'Doherty.
Well,
and singled out.
Well, by whom? But you see, I wouldn't call that an attack. I would call it an observation, and I don't think it's an attack on any person or individuals on account of their colour or otherwise. But we've had.
Go on.
Well, there's a strange selectivity about all of this. I was attacked by people.
I think that was terrible. What happened to you?
Yeah. Well, it is still to be. Nobody in the media from which you're getting that information, Fergus, has as much as mentioned it since it happened. I had a book out about it the year before last, as you know.
Yeah.
Not one of the media organisations based in Dublin.
They didn't want to know.
They didn't want to. Well, they knew all about it. All about it. I don't know if I told you before, but I got one call from a journalist in Dublin about my book. And that was from an individual in the Sunday Times who left a message on my phone. And it turned out that he actually knew the name of my book and he knew all about it, or a little bit about it. And he said, John, I've heard that there's a book being submitted to the revenue commissioners for artist exemption. And it sounds very much like yours. I wonder, could you confirm if it's yours or not? So It wasn't mine. I hadn't submitted the book for artist exemption at all. As
What's that?
It's a thing introduced by Charlie Haughey way back, the man that is excoriated by every artist under the sun in Ireland, which allows it's been modified to some extent, but it used to allow artists to be tax free in Ireland. That's why U2 still live here, for example, or it's why various novelists have lived here over the years, and it's still going, but it's a bit more circumscribed now, I gather. But this journalist, so-called, I mean, to be honest, he was doing, if I may say so, Fergus, again, and I'm not getting at you, but he was doing kind of the same thing you were doing. He was carrying out the instructions of the culture, of the journalistic culture.
Well, I'm in Alabama, but go on.
Which is to get somebody, to get Waters. You see?
That's not what I'm trying to do at all. Go on.
Oh no, I'm not saying you're doing, but that's the kind of the tenor where you're picking those signals up from. Because I think, well, put it this way, Fergus, I believe this firmly. What I just described to you there with Des Hannafin, I believe if I was to take you out some night to meet Gemma O'Doherty, you would actually come away with something like the same feelings as I had coming home from meeting with Des Hannafin.
Maybe I would, John. Gee, I don't think I would, but go on. Fine.
Well, you see, I didn't think I would either with Des, but I did. And what I'm asking you, Fergus, is that maybe you just keep a little bit open and don't listen to those dark voices from the inner sanctums of Irish journalism, because they are trying to hide their own cowardice and hide their own failures and hide their own corruptions in order to, because as long as Jim O'Doherty's out there, they are shamed, they are indicted, they are named.
There must be some middle ground there between.
Oh, there is indeed.
You know what I mean?
It's called freedom of speech, and it's called fair democratic discourse, which is long absent, and that's why you get people on Twitter. I don't approve of Twitter. Is my bottom line at all?
I hate it.
I'm actually on Twitter now, bizarrely, or rumor has it I'm on Twitter. There's an account which has been generated in my name because I'm a candidate. It's only going to last the length of my candidacy, which has only got another, 12 days to run or something like that. And I believe that Twitter is an abomination, frankly. I think it's a terribly destructive instrument in our democracy and all democracies. I wrote an article there in First Things a few months ago, which I was quite proud of, although I don't know if anybody read it, because I didn't hear anything about it, ironically, because it was about my deafness, my deaf ear. I have a condition in it called hyperacusis. It's not as if it's purely deaf. Mm-hmm. It's actually worse. If you can imagine it being worse than being deaf, that's what it is.
Describe this. It's bizarre. I heard you describe this. It sounds bizarre.
It is. I wouldn't have imagined this. You'd asked me, if you said to me before I got this, what would it be like, do you think, to be half deaf? To have lost one ear? I would thought, well, actually, you wouldn't be half deaf. You'd actually be probably 30% deaf, because the one ear would kind of more or less cover, pretty much everything, really. But it's not like that, because what happens is that in this situation, I'm perfect, insofar as you wouldn't even know, I wouldn't even know I haven't got two ears, because I'm able to hear you, you're able to hear me, we're able to converse, because there's no noise around. But if I'm in a cafe or in a busy street, my hearing in this ear goes completely, because it gets drowned out by the effects of the hyperacusis in the other ear, which is a kind of it picks up all kinds of nasty, dirty sounds like motorbikes and things like that, and amplifies them in a way that actually I don't hear, but at the same time, it picks up the vibration. So there's like a silent, I think this is something like what it is. It's kind of hard to describe, but it has the effect anyhow of making me completely deaf in the other ear as well for those few moments while I'm there. Now, I wrote this article and I talked about Twitter as being the same thing in our culture, that it amplifies the worst, the ugliest, the nastiest, and the most toxic kinds of forms of commentary, and drowns out the discourse which we need to be having. And I call that Twitter acusis. And I think that's our society suffers badly now from Twitter acusis, and if I had my way, I'm not naturally a dictator, but I would immediately issue an edict. If I became El Presidente de Irlanda, I would immediately issue an edict.
I would support you on that one.
To remove all Twitter personnel from the territory forthwith. and their buildings and their computers and everything to do with them.
Anyway, what does that have to do with our conversation? Oh, just the Twitter. You're on Twitter.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think everybody says stuff on Twitter that is, different, let me say, than what they might say in normal discourse. And my point is, let's have the normal discourse, and then we need Twitter. That's my point.
So, did you think of running for as an independent? Why did you decide to run? Why did you decide to run in the first place?
Well, no, I didn't. I didn't. Well, okay, I didn't want to run, frankly. I'd rather boil my head. But I think the crisis is extremely acute now, because we have a cadre of politicians who seem to have no regard whatsoever for the wishes of the Irish people, or for listening to the Irish people, or for talking to the Irish people, except at election time. And things are being done that are not, democratic.
Like what?
Well, I mean, we've had 2 referendums in the last 6 years, and it has been known throughout that period that there are at least 500,000 votes more than what ought to be there on the electoral register, and nobody's shown the slightest interest in finding out how those votes got there or who they are.
Is that the case?
Yes, it is the case. It's been reported. That's the ironic thing about it. I mean, most of these things don't tend to get reported because they don't suit, but this one has.
What's going on there?
Well, I can tell you exactly what's going on. I believe there's a lot of people who are not entitled to vote in our elections are voting. Possibly people who have come from foreign countries, which I think is part of the thinking and having them here in the first place. I also believe that students, in many instances, are voting twice, and that the whole thing is set up for that purpose. There were stories in the 2015 referendum of members of Garda Síochána sitting out at tables in universities, signing up voters.
Where is that information coming from about the 500,000?
Well, if you do a Google search, you'll find it. You'll find
really?
Reports. You'll find selective reports. There's one I remember off the top of my head, in January 2016, the month before the last general election, News Talk did a report on it. Now, they didn't connect it in the way that I'm connecting it in, but yes. I found it extraordinary that they didn't, in that course of that report, draw attention to the fact that we just previous 7 months earlier, had a referendum in which these votes presumably were cast, or were liable to be cast, or liable to have an effect on the outcome, and nobody seemed to think that this was in any way important. So that's the kind of thing. It's just an example. It's give you another example from last night. When Justin Barrett arrived in his car, he was surrounded by a mob. They broke his windscreen. They kicked his car. They threatened him. They menaced him. And the guards, when they came along, asked him to leave because he was they told him he was inciting the situation.
I have a very short snippet of an article from 17 years ago, and what date? 2 months ago, October 2002, forgive me. The pro-life campaign yesterday attacked No to Nice and youth defence campaigner Justin Barrett for attending conferences of an organisation with neo-Nazi links. John Smith, spokesman for the pro-life campaign, whose members include former Senator, funny we mentioned him earlier, whose members include former Senator Des Hannafin and Trinity Law Professor William Binchy, lashed out at Mr. Barrett, saying no amount of spin or evasion could explain away the seriousness of attending such gatherings. And it's my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that he spoke at such a gathering about the right to life among people like that. So I think it's because of articles like that people have a problem with Justin Barrett.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember much more recently there was a case where a couple of young guy from young Fine Gael went to a conference in America and was attacked in precisely the same way. What does links to far-right organizations mean? What indeed does far-right organizations mean? Neo-Nazi,
people who have shaved heads and do Nazi salutes, maybe.
Well, not necessarily, because I have
not necessarily exactly, but
yeah, I have heard the term I've heard the term, for example, alt-right and far-right being bandied around by all kinds of people. I'm sure it's even been appended to myself. Well, I don't have a shaved head so far anyway. And Justin Barrett was a lot younger then than he is now, as we all would have been. I haven't spoken to him about these events. I've only spoken to him a couple of times. I regard him as a very significant political personality, and I think he deserves to be heard. And in any kind of fair society, he would be heard. If you, silence people, you create conditions in which you suppress the impulse of democracy, which is towards conversation. And
so how bad does it have to be for you to be prevented from voicing your views, do you think? How bad should it have to get? And how can you give me an example of something someone might say that you would say, okay, you actually should give away that microphone and sit down and mind your own business?
No, I think that's a very extreme. I don't know of any particular situation. I mean, we had a situation here in Ireland going back many decades, going back to the late 60s, where the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin, Provisional Sinn Féin, which is now Sinn Féin,
yes,
were barred from speaking on on the national broadcaster.
Section 31, isn't that it?
That's correct, yeah. And I oppose that. I disagree with it profoundly, because I thought that they were, even though I didn't agree with some of the things that the Provisional IRA were doing, that I thought it was an extremely dangerous thing for them to be silenced, and that as long as they were silenced, they were left out in the cold, and there was no possibility of drawing them back in. So as a journalist, I took it upon myself very often, even though I wasn't necessarily in agreement with them, to put across their point of view, particularly in the 1990s in my column in the Irish Times, at a time when they were deeply unpopular and deeply the culture was deeply antagonistic towards them, and as a result it became deeply antagonistic towards me, not for the last time. So I'm a great believer in that, the idea that just as politics is an alternative to war, conversation is an alternative to fisticuffs, and that we should uphold the sacredness of the national conversation in all ways, in all respects, at all times, and give a space to every voice. Because, as John Stuart Mill said, the importance of giving space to every voice is that the voice that is a lone voice, that has a singular voice, may potentially, possibly, turn out to be the one that is right. And if a society fails to give that voice a hearing, then it in the first place loses the opportunity to be alerted to the value of the argument. But so, in the contrary case, where that viewpoint is not right, it's not correct, or is deemed by history not to be correct, the society will have denied it the possibility of refuting the argument at an earlier stage. And that's a critical part of the whole basis of free speech.
I wanted to ask you, actually, I'm glad you brought up Mill, because I appreciate your consistency that going way back, you wanted free speech for Sinn Féin and the like.
Yes.
John Stuart Mill talks also about the harm principle and the corn dealer, and how if you are outside the house of a corn dealer passing out leaflets and pamphlets saying that something like selling corn like this guy is extortion or something like that to an angry mob of protesters, and that results in the corn dealer being attacked, then you are violating the harm principle, which says if your speech leads to harm, you no longer are entitled to free speech. So again, we don't, if we are following John Stuart Mill, it's not just license to say whatever.
Look, I don't say there's an unqualified right. I mean, that's the old thing about you're not entitled to shout fire in a crowded theatre.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's the same principle, I guess.
Yes.
I'm not saying that. There's common sense must come to bear here. But nevertheless, there has to be room for error, and there has to be room for, correction. And the way to correct a conversation that goes wrong is for the moderator to be fair and reasonable and interrupt and say, no, sorry, you've gone too far there.
Yes.
But I would be able to accept these arguments much more readily had anybody been making them when I was the one being attacked.
Yes, I understand.
They weren't.
So if panty, what do you call that affair? I've heard the term pantygate. Do you like that term?
Oh no, I do not.
What would be a better term about that whole period in your life? That episode.
The Great Lie of Montrose.
So if the Great Lie of Montrose had never been allowed to prosper, you probably wouldn't be in the situation you're in now. Is that fair to say? You're kind of, and I'm not saying this this delegitimizes you, but you seem to be motivated by a spirit of anarchism about the system, and it's so corrupt, and you've experienced that corruption as you see it.
Yeah.
So personally and so powerfully that no matter the means, no matter who you're with, you want to just tear down Irish journalism and the Irish political consensus.
That's if I don't want to be patronizing. That's a really good question. But the core of it is wrong for this reason. Like, you see, I was always, as people would call me, a controversialist, contrarian, these kind of nonsensical phrases. I was a maverick. I was somebody outside the pale of journalism, always. And that became, and you see, that escalated, not because of, I believe, me, because all I was doing my job as I saw it, and my job as I had been employed to do it. There wasn't any point in me writing articles for the Irish Times every week, anodyne articles, the same as Fenton O'Toole's, for example. One Fenton is quite enough, thank you very much, for any newspaper, in my opinion. I did what I did. And in the nature of that, you see, there was an escalation which you wouldn't have been necessary, and why should you be paying close attention? But it went, right up, it was kind of like a 45-degree ascent.
Yes.
Through the 1990s, an escalation. I mean, I started off, as I said, kind of, I suppose, being out there on issues like the national question. And also on trying to reconcile or not the tradition, the heroic tradition of Irish nationalism with what was currently happening at that time, the provisionals and so on. And I at the same time being fair to the provisionals. Not that I had any affinity with them or closeness with them. I mean, yes. I met them. I met all of the top leaders and became civilly, on speaking terms to them, but they were never what you would call any more than just people I ran into. But, in some ways I liked some and didn't like others. I have to say I liked Martin McGuinness, as a person.
He seems to have been quite personable, all right.
He was personable, but he had a dark past, and we can't deny that either. And, and I was aware of that and so on. But, there's a strange thing, even when somebody has that kind of history, they have redeeming qualities as human beings. And again, that goes back to that openness that I'm talking about. Not that you should necessarily allow that to dupe you into turning a blind eye to some of the darker parts, but that it's just another thing to be put in the mix. So there was at the national question, there was the EU thing. There was also the question of what people call rural Ireland. I came from rural Ireland. I couldn't actually. I came from a town. I was a townie, true and true. And we were not culties in any sense, having come from the main street in Castlereagh, I can assure you. So I was writing about this in a particular way. I wrote Driving at the Crossroads about it, about that whole thing, and wrote many articles through the 90s about the neglect of rural Ireland, or the countryside, as I would have called it, the the disproportionate pull which Dublin was exerting
Yes.
on the resources nationally, and all of the life of the nation was being sucked in there to the great detriment of the city and the country.
Yes.
And so on. All these questions, and there was lots of other things as well that I took on economists over there thinking, and you name it. There's a lot of stuff there. I'm quite proud of that period, actually. People don't know anything about it now, of course. They only know me for certain things, but I wrote about entirely different things back then because there were different things happening. Then in the mid-90s, I started to write about what is nowadays called gender.
Yes.
Family law courts, male suicide, all those related issues. And that caused massive eruptions in the Irish Times. And I subsequently found out that there were serious attempts to have me fired on innumerable occasions. And I could feel that. I could feel the ground, trembling under my feet sometimes. But they never quite got to me. They never got me. Until 2002, when Geraldine Kennedy came in, and suddenly I was ironically sucked into something which I wasn't paying any much attention to, frankly. Again, I don't want to bore. This is a kind of a local event.
Go on.
It was there was a bit of a controversy erupted in the media generally about the level of remuneration being given to the editor of the Irish Times, who was Geraldine Kennedy, and Maeve Donovan, who was the chief executive, I think is what they called her, or general manager, perhaps. And this controversy blew up, and I was minding my own business. I wasn't getting involved in it because it seemed to be too much, of a domestic event. And but one day I got a call from a colleague who had just emerged from an NUJ meeting, National Union of Journalists, discussing this very thing, and they were all outraged. He told me that none of our columnists had written anything about this. And so this conversation seemed to be clear what he was getting at. So I said, Patsy, for it was he, are you saying that you want me to write about this? He says, well, yes, if you would. I says, well, I will.
AKA Thomas 49, is that what it was? Is that
yes,
the name?
Indeed, the very man, one and the same. And so I did write about it, and then all hell broke loose because the editor, having first of all agreed to publish the article, after some negotiation and some modifications, which I was freely willing to enter into, then changed her mind and told me under no circumstances to publish it. And I said, well, that's your decision, fine, you're the editor, I'm not. So I didn't make anything of it. But lo and behold, the following week, didn't my article, which I had almost forgotten about by then, appear in every single one of the Sunday newspapers. And all hell broke loose again. And I then went on the radio and I talked about this. I was invited on, I've talked about this. And I used the word, and it's a very, to this day, I don't think that there's anything wrong with the meaning I attached this word. And I was talking about the editor in particular. And I said that she had been compromised by the situation she had inherited. That was Geraldine Kennedy. And what I meant by that, quite obviously, was that it wasn't down to her. It wasn't her fault. She had simply inherited a particular situation, a particular salary. She took the job. She'd walked into it, as it were. That was what I meant.
Yes.
I didn't mean compromised in the vague, innuendo sense that it sometimes be used. I mean, I was giving quite substantial information around my meaning. It has another meaning. People sort of use that as a kind of he's somewhat compromised, like without saying, well, what do you mean? Be clear. Mm-hmm. And I was being clear. So I didn't, but she decided to take offense at this a week later and sent me a letter, which seemed to be very much a firing letter, although she denied that afterwards. And she told me if I didn't like things in the Irish Times, I could go somewhere where I would find things more congenial. And so I regarded myself as fired. Indeed, I heard on the radio next year that I had been fired. And so then I got back in. There was that most bizarre thing. I hadn't been in the NUJ, you see, for years.
Yes.
Because I had a row with them. And a colleague of mine who was very senior in the Times and had retired contacted me. He'd heard me on the radio and he heard this word compromise and he kind of thought, he saw it all. And he said, you could be in a little bit of trouble over that word. He said, now he might have other information. He probably heard she was probably roaring around the Irish Times, and people were reporting to him. Anyway, he said to me, you're in the NUJ, of course, he says, which would be a naturally precautionary measure in situations like that.
Yes.
And I said, well, actually, I'm not, no. And he said, oh, well, then he says, you better join. I said, sure, maybe I will, when things quieten down. He said, no, he said, I think you should join before they quieten down, And I said, well, then, maybe in a week or two I will. Yeah, sure. No, he says, I think you should join today. And you should rejoin today. And he says, in fact, I will get the forms now. I will sign them for you. I will get them countersigned, and I will be around your house at 3:00. And he did. And not only did he that, but he had them countersigned by no less a personage than Thomas 59.
Sorry, was the person on the phone Thomas 59, or was
no, it was another individual who shall remain nameless for the moment.
Okay, but Thomas 59 came to you and with the forms.
No, the other person did, but he had them count. That was the irony of it, or is the irony.
They were signed by Thomas 59.
Yes, they were countersigned by him. Yeah.
Sorry, what does countersign mean?
Well, you need 2 signatures, you see, to.
Sorry, got it.
To authorize your membership or whatever it is. So I was restored to my membership with the NUJ, and of course nobody knew this except myself and these other 2 individuals. And by the time I was fired, I think there was a rumor that I wasn't in the NUJ anymore, but I think that rumor turned out to be false. Then you see. So anyway, that's kind of how that worked out, and I was back. I said to people, that I was fired for 3 days, but on the 3rd day I rose again, and I was there then subsequently for another 12 years or something like that. And I don't know why I'm telling you that story, Fergus.
Well, I want to pick up on that. If you were walking down the pier.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I come back on the pier in a minute, but I just want to finish my train of thought on this, because I think I know now. I remember what you were asking me. So it's not what you think. I mean, you see, I was already out there. I mean, in 2012, I was in the children referendum, and that was an extraordinary event. I was one of 4 people who opposed the government's policy of changing the constitution, as they would have put it, or did put it, to give rights to children. As I put it, to take rights from the parents and take them to the state.
Yes.
And I opposed that on that basis. With 3
Who were the other 3?
There was Cathy Sennett, my great friend, Jerry Fahey, another friend, and Father McKevitt, who was the editor of Alive. We didn't work all together. We worked separately, but we came together for certain things and had a couple of press conferences, I think, and we just wrote articles, did a few interviews, and I was involved simultaneously. Mark McChrystal was taking a case to the Supreme Court, to the High Court and Supreme Court, to query the government's expenditure of money on propaganda, which was one-sided. And I did an affidavit for that, and lo and behold, we won. And a week before the thing, it turned out the Supreme Court is absolutely staggering. Now, I don't think it will ever happen again with the way things are going. But the Supreme Court, actually, it was a good Supreme Court then. You had people like Hardiman, Justice Hardiman, who was a fine judge.
He died recently.
He did, yeah. He was
a few years ago, I suppose.
He was a hard man to get on with, but he was a great judge. And so I was involved in that, and I took all the flack then. I mean, this was the bizarre thing, Fergus, that a journalist whose voice is about writing and speaking, right? That's as I saw it. Because of the failure of the political establishment to create an opposition within itself, I was forced into action. I was called into action, I felt, in order to make this case in the public arena. Now, that was a job I didn't relish, in the sense that I don't like the idea of having to take political stances as such in precise political arguments. Yes. But that was the beginning of that process for me. And the same thing happened then in 2015 when I was attacked in advance. I mean, they basically there was no basis at all for attacking me when I was attacked, because I hadn't made any statements or to damn about gay marriage one way or the other. Nobody knew what I thought, but least of all myself, actually. I had no clue. where I stood on it, except in general that I had a sense that I had spent 20 odd years arguing for fathers' rights and had been denied by a political establishment which is now seemingly bending over backwards to take a deeply eccentric view of family rights, while still not seeking to amend this extraordinarily egregious omission in the canon of rights in relation to family. However, so I found myself again out and again, and so in those three referendums, I kind of bizarrely found myself sucked into the public arena as, in effect, a kind of politician.
Like and always on the unpopular side.
Yeah, the no side. You see, this is the thing they do. You see, they give you the no.
Yeah.
So you're the negative. You're the naysayer.
Regressive.
Yeah, well, you see, I ended up in the bizarre position of actually being on the Vincent Brown show on TV3, arguing head to head. This was like the leaders' debate of the time.
Yes.
And the other side was Micheál Martin, who was the leader of Fianna Fáil, who was leader of the opposition.
Yes.
And I was up against him, and he was supposed to be the leader of opposition. I said, Micheál, what's going on? You know, you're supposed to be the leader of opposition, not me. I should be at home in my bed. You know, like this is the bizarre thing that's already was beginning to unravel in our culture politically, that I began to, and at that time I had no clue what was going on. I have to be frank about it. You know, I mean, when you look back now, Fergus, it's quite extraordinary. You know, I don't know how closely you're following this current crazy discussion that's going on about transgender and all of that. And we have the bizarre situation now where parents are no longer, you know, regarded as the primary rearers of their children in relation to, you know, matters like this. So, you know, we have medical professionals and so on deciding that it's okay for them to allow children to transition and give them hormones and so on.
How young are they allowed to do that?
Well, I've heard of cases, not in Ireland, but I've heard of cases 9 and 10 years of age.
And what about in Ireland?
Well, I know that there were serious attempts to get it under 16. And so far, I think that's been resisted, but only because there has been a huge uprising from parents and from others like that, and from religious.
There's a trend that's coming. That's what you're saying.
Well, yes, but I would say this, that, you know, I mean, we made many arguments in 2012 about the dangers of the amendment that the government was proposing, and they were generally based on the principle that, you know, parents are the primary carers for their children. Parents love their children. They're to be trusted in caring for their children more so than anybody, more so by far than the state.
Yes.
But we didn't actually see anything like this coming. Mm-hmm. We never thought that actually one day we would become vindicated on the basis that there was now a risk, that there is now serious possibility that parents trying to protect their own children in their craziness, destroying their own lives, will be unable to do anything because of the 2012 amendment. And that's the terrible, terrible tragedy, that we were right 100% about that. We got 42% of the vote. Bizarre. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. Like, we got a better, with 4 of us, we got more votes than were on the no side in the gay marriage or in the abortion referendum. Which had much more, by the way, much more. I mean, the church was all on the other ones. On the other, but in ours they'd sat it out. I remember I was on the Broadcasting Commission at the time, and Bob Collins, the chairman of the board, the Monday after the count, the vote, he came up to me and said, you know, 42%. He said, you know, if you were a leader of Fianna Fáil, you'd be Taoiseach now.
Yeah.
Like, that was an extraordinary result, but obviously
I get you. For such a small group, it was yeah, I get you.
It's quite phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And to win a Supreme Court action in the middle of it was extraordinary. Mark McChrystal did an extraordinary job in taking that case, and this is real citizenship. You know, when the opposite, but when politicians fail to do those jobs, which are there, that's the purpose politicians are there. Citizens have to step out of their normal lives. I don't want to be doing this. I would prefer to be sitting at home writing short stories or songs, you know. But in
your vision.
Yeah, well, I'd go back. I would be very happily, you know. I don't care. You know, I'd be quite honest with you, Fergus. You know, I'd much prefer having been in Eurovision and coming last than never having been in Eurovision, like a lot of the people who were slagging me.
I know, I know. No,
But
I think it's a good metaphor. It's better to come last than not to run at all, I suppose. If you were to meet Thomas 49 on Thomas 29, is it?
39, isn't it?
39.
Hard to keep up.
I think it's 49, is it?
Gosh, you've thrown me there.
I said
I'd have to look it up.
5 minutes ago. Thomas 49.
Is it 59? God, maybe
So,
there's more than one of them, huh? Maybe there's a few of them. Is it?
maybe there's a few. Let me just bear with me here. I want to get this right. Thomas 59.
59. Yes, it is 59.
Because that's probably his year of birth.
Yeah.
Thomas 59. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you were to meet Thomas 59 on Dún Laoghaire Pier, what kind of interaction would take place?
Oh, there would be no interaction.
Do you speak? Do you give him a dirty look? Do you?
Oh no, I don't.
Punch him in the face? Do you know what I mean? Like, what's your relationship like now?
There isn't zero. There's no relationship. There will never be a relationship of any kind.
Did you ever confront him in person about what happened on Twitter?
No.
Okay. Well, I don't want to dwell on that because you don't seem to be you don't seem to have anything more to say, I suppose.
No, I don't, because can I say this? You see, the issue there, as far as I left the Irish Times because of that incident, and I want to be completely clear about why that was. I didn't leave because of what he did, or because it was him, or anything like that. I left because I wrote to the editor and asked him to intervene to put an end to this. And he didn't have the manners to respond. I
am slow to do this, but I think I'm actually just going to go ahead and do it. Would you mind outlining what actually happened in that episode? Because a lot of people that I've talked to about it haven't a clue that this happened.
Well, they should read my book. It's all there.
I know they should, but people don't really read nowadays, and there's only
bad roads. If you go into Eason's and ask them, they won't have it, but they have a copy under the stairs. You know, they always keep one in every single Eason's shop. They keep one copy in case I come in and ask about it, and then they produce it. That's like kind of a joke, but not quite. Yeah. I mean, in the course of all this, you see. Okay, well, I mean, let me set the scene. I mean, you know, I was attacked by the drag queen, and completely baselessly. But I mean, that's kind of beside the point. Even if it was, if there was a base to there was no basis for him attacking me in the way he did. But there wasn't in my case at all. And he subsequently admitted this and then retracted his admission that there wasn't. That's quite a bizarre thing, this drag queen. He gave an interview in July of that year in which he said that he had nothing to raise with me at all because I hadn't actually done any things he said I'd done. And then in September, I think a book came out, which he must have been writing at the same time, if he were writing it at all. And it reiterated all the original arguments or things, the slurs he cast in my direction. So it's hard to work out what's going on with somebody like that. But immediately I noticed that some colleagues of mine, so-called, from the Irish Times were joining in this witch hunt against me. There was a massive surge against me. I outline all this in the book where I was, you know, my inbox would be filled with filth in the morning when I would wake up, you know.
Calling you a homophobe and
that was the least of it, you know. I mean, terrible personal stuff, all kinds of things. I'll speak. I put in some of them more sanitized, some of the more printable in my book.
Yeah.
But and then I noticed that one or two of Irish Times people were joining, and then there was a series of articles published attacking me from the Irish Times, and one of them was particularly egregious because the person who wrote it had actually written to me a week before the drag queen appeared on TV, asking me if I would help her with a book she was writing about gay marriage.
That was Una Mullally?
Yes, and this was a woman who had previously attacked me in Yorkshire Times when she used to work with the Sunday Tribune. But again, in the spirit that I've been trying to outline to you about kind of openness, I thought about it and said, well, look, she wants to write a book. I'll try and help her. I've nothing to hide about my positions. I don't know, it'll maybe help me to tease out my position if I have
And it
to.
was a really thorough position, and it
Yeah,
wasn't a one-liner. Like I couldn't even comprehend the essence of what you're saying because it was so substantial, you know,
yes, yes, it was. It was. I mean, I
and
surprised myself.
nuanced. It
Yeah,
was so nuanced. That's
yeah,
what I
because
mean.
it was the first time I'd really set it all down for myself, and in the end, you would have to be. I would have been uncertain where I actually stood on the
Yes.
substantive question of gay marriage itself. Like, in other words, if you ask me, did I mind if gay people got married, insofar as they care whether I mind or not, or whether would have a vote in the matter. And if I was asked a simple question at that point, as to whether, under some new statute, the government might provide for gay marriage, I would probably have voted yes to it,
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't have any objection.
Skin in the game.
Yeah, but I didn't have any objection to two men or two women getting hitched and calling that hitching marriage. Some say that was not any issue I had. But by the time the referendum came around, that had changed in this way, in two ways. Well, first of all, I already had, as I said, because of my long history of talking about. I mean, I had failed to persuade the political class to give me, a father, the rights that I was entitled to as a father, to acknowledge them in the law of the land, in my own country. I'd reared my daughter without the help of the state, in the teeth of the state, to some extent, and then in the teeth of the neighbouring state also. And it cost me a hell of a lot of money and a lot of stress and agony. And, that was unnecessary. And that was an attack not just on me, but also on my daughter, in my view. But, and from that, I had a certain view of child rearing and family and parenting and all that. And, that's complicated, but that was where I stood on that. So I had a certain question about the whole idea, of children becoming commodities, as it seems to me implicit in the whole thing, the whole exercise that has now been unfurled before us. But more fundamentally, I had an objection to the way that this was being done in constitutional terms, where the existing normative nuclear family was being shoved aside and made to create room for this new, completely artificial and in my view, quite arbitrary concept of family. So I objected to that. But the most fundamental thing of all, the more objection I had, was on the basis of the behaviour, starting with the drag queen.
Yes.
And the entire lobby and all of its allies and friends and all of their skullduggery and scummery. I said, if these people are allowed to have their way with Irish society, there is nothing safe. Because, I in that time, like, I remember, like, one night, I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but this is just one example off the top of my head. I was going down to my home county, very near the end of the campaign, to speak in a school, not about the referendum, as it happened, but to launch a school magazine for the students who were interested in journalism. And they invited me to come down and do that. And I always do those things pro bono. Always have. Anything to do with schools. I never would charge expenses or fees or anything like that. So I was going down, and on the halfway down, I got a call, a very excited call from the headmistress, who said that she'd been subjected all day long to abusive phone calls from these people.
Wow.
Telling her that if John Waters was allowed to speak, they would come and they would cause absolute havoc at the event. And her protestations that this had nothing to do with the referendum fell on complete deaf ears. They were just absolutely insistent. And the calls kept coming and coming and coming all day long, she told me. And in the end, she had gone to the guards and put them on standby. And I said, well, I don't care. I'm not afraid. You see, the word homophobe implies fear, that you're afraid of these people. I'm not afraid of these people. I am not afraid of these people. I'm never afraid of cowards. You need to have backbone to strike fear into me. And these people have zero backbone. So they didn't show up, predictably. And the night went ahead. But that's the kind of thing they do. And they're still doing it. And it has bled into everything now. Everybody does that. Like, again, last night would not have happened had these people not got away with what they got away with in that debate. I am convinced. So they've changed Irish democracy fundamentally in the most appalling way.
So you would say every time, every little extra bit they get away with, they'll go more and more and more the next time.
Well, yeah, but more fundamentally that, Fergus, it's part of a new phenomenon in democracy, or not democracy, if you like, which is that the certain people now regard the whole process of democracy as a bit of a pain in the ass, you know? Why do we have to actually check with those ignorant people as to whether we get what we want or not? We should just get it.
You're referring to like the kind of rhetoric around Brexit and maybe Trump and things like that, like that let's redo the referendum. And
oh yeah, well, that's another aspect of it, certainly. Yeah, well, although it's very interesting, you know, that the very same category of person who, if I had suggested we run the gay marriage event, a referendum on the basis of these illegalities that have been outlined, and I'm only scratching the surface here, they were the very same people who were arguing for a rerun of the Brexit referendum, yes, with completely straight faces. So that's kind of, again, a part of what I would call the corruption of public thought and public discourse, you know, where there's no consistency, and nor is there any requirement for consistency. And the journalists on whom one would depend to interrogate those people and point out those inconsistencies assiduously are no longer doing it, because they're on the same side as these people. That's the problem. So in general, vastly in general, I mean, overwhelmingly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's kind of another issue. So that's kind of where I fundamentally ended up on the side I ended up. I describe myself slightly humorously, but not entirely, as a draft dodger on the gay marriage question. I was because I turned down, I would say, dozens, if not hundreds, of invitations over the recent years, last 2 or 3 years, before the referendum, or before the drag queen episode. Certainly over the previous 12 months, there was quite an upping, a ramping up of RTE and other radio stations and TV stations wanting to talk about gay marriage, homosexuality, all these things. And I absolutely always said, no, I don't, not interested. Yes. Not interested in the subject whatsoever, but that didn't save me. You see, the thing that the error I made was, or whatever I did was, actually the day before that drag queen episode, I had a column in. The first thing I'd ever even tangentially touched on it, I think in an Irish Times column, was that I actually talked about being at a broadcasting conference. I was a member of the Broadcasting Authority, as I said at the time, and we had a conference, and it was to discuss generally with different people involved in the industry, you know, various issues that they might have. And I noticed sitting there, as I was listening to the contributions on the floor, that there was a theme immediately after about half an hour, that every one of the contributors who had spoken up to that point, including a spokesperson on behalf of the gay lobby, was saying the same thing. They were saying that once it is clear that our issue is popular, we shouldn't any longer have to go through any democratic process. In other words, once an opinion poll says that people, a majority, support gay marriage, then we shouldn't have to have a referendum. And other people should not be allowed to express opinions against gay marriage. Mm. That was it. And the same, we got the same, there was another speaker on climate change saying the same thing, that people who were what he called climate deniers shouldn't be allowed to speak. Mm. And there was somebody from Fine Gael who thought that the Coughlin judgment, which has to do with allocation of time in referendum debates, yes, or election debate, that was a terrible imposition on Fine Gael. You know, and I struck me, this is a really new phenomenon whereby people are saying that the democratic process now is a problem.
Yes.
That it's like an obstacle that has to be got over in order to achieve what we as politicians wanted to achieve, or as public activists want to achieve. That's not how I see democracy at all, I assure you. Nor is it the way that the average citizen should see democracy if he or she knows what is good for him or her.
You see it as something more sacred, I suppose, than that.
Well, sacred is a bit of a woolly word.
Let's not use that word, but let's come back to...
Yeah, but you're right. No, I'm being a bit...
Let's come back to Thomas 59.
Please, do we have to?
Sorry, we don't. But again, I said this the last time I spoke to you. I didn't want to drag you through it blow by blow, but I did, because I wanted to be known by people who don't know it. But as you said, they can buy the book.
Well, okay, I'll just say one thing. I mean, you know, there were certain things that he did. He tweeted under this pseudonym, this individual, and we found him by accident.
Yes.
Say. You know, I have very good scouts out there, very close to me, who were very good at that kind of thing. And there was this kind of, because we were seeing all these stuff coming from Irish Times people, you know, and they started, you know, looking at different connections. I don't know how you do that, but, you know, you can do searches and things. And they kept coming up with this name and saying, do you know, who's this? He seems not to like you very much. And I said, I have no idea. And I, you know, it was a very rough time. And I remember actually, I wasn't sleeping very well through it all. But one Saturday morning, I'm trying to give the game away here now. I was having a bit of a lie-in, you know, and the bedroom door burst open, and these two people rushed in, said, "We've got him, we've got him," and they told me who it was. And I think if I don't die of a heart attack, I don't think I'll ever die of a heart attack. My heart must be very strong.
You couldn't believe it.
I survived that moment. I couldn't believe it. But at least what I couldn't believe in particular were the things he was saying about me. Like one of the tweets I remember was saying that there was something about Uganda having made homosexuality illegal. And he said that John Waters was reported to be heading to Uganda. And there was, he described me as, subsequently then when he got to know that we had found him, he announced to his, he subsequently tried to deny it was him, but in the meantime, he gave away the game by saying this. He said that one has been rumbled by H2O.
What does that mean? I don't understand that.
H2O means water.
Water, yeah.
And as he subsequently characterized, he corrected that, by the way, in a subsequent tweet, because he was very punctilious about correcting his tweets. Another tweet, he said, sorry, that should be H2Os, so waters. So one has been rumbled by waters. That was the code, you see? Sorry,
water. I didn't make that connection, of course. Yeah. Okay.
But then the rest of it was, but who cares? Who needs such cruel friends? And now this is the real kicker. During all this period, Fergus, when I started writing about fatherhood back in the mid-90s, even though I was being excoriated by all and sundry in the Irish Times and political establishment, feminists, you name it, I started engaging in something that I'd never thought I would as a journalist have to, be involved in. But I was being contacted by fathers and the mothers of fathers and then the new partners of fathers who were in absolute destitution and despair over what was happening to them with regard to their children. And I ended up becoming a kind of an amateur counselor.
Yeah.
Going to meet these people and having coffees with them and reassuring them. I'm trying to help them wherever I could, give them advice, maybe get them in touch with a good lawyer, give them, a bit background, general sketch on how to do something or whatever. But in general, just to comfort them and to stop them killing themselves by and large,
I heard personal testimony to that effect from a local business owner in Dunleary who says he regularly sees you, people drop in letters for you to contact you, and subsequently meetings are set up. So
yeah,
that's acknowledged.
It's the hidden Ireland, Fergus. It's the thing that in all of this talk about rights you never hear about. And I was buried. This is one of the things that really hurt me most deeply about the whole thing, that people knew I'd been doing this for years. And, at the very least they might have said along the way was, well, Waters is a bit mad because he's always banging on about fathers was the phrase they always used about me when it suited them. But now when it was the opportunity was to depict me as a homophobe, they forgot that I had been always banging on about fathers, you see. But in the course of this, a few months before this episode happened, I'd been contacted by a particular individual who was in dire straits in the same way. And I'd been dealing with this individual for quite a period, maybe several months.
Yeah.
Phone calls, texts, and so on, and advising and emails and so on, and advising insofar as, because this was a pretty bad situation, and it's pretty bad. It's pretty as extreme as I've indicated there.
Yes.
And this person was a very close relative of Thomas 59, as it turned out. Well, I knew this all along because he had been referred to me by Thomas 59, or by the Atavar of Thomas 59. Avatar, is that the word? Avatar. Anyway, the alias, or the realius of Thomas 59. And Thomas 59 didn't describe me as cruel. I cannot still comprehend that.
Mm.
And the whole ranks of journalism closed in around him.
Mm.
There was a puff piece written in the Sunday Independent about him to protect him. The Irish Times closed ranks. The Irish stage editor, Kevin O'Sullivan, absolutely wouldn't respond to any communication from me at all. And in the end, I just said, okay, I wasn't dealing with him. I was dealing with, Dennis Staunton, his deputy. And I eventually, I'd already kind of indicated my desire to leave the paper on account of the Mullally article. She had written an article about you mentioned about, I forgot to fill in that part. You said I'd written to her, and I had written this expansive thing. And in the immediate aftermath of the drag queen business, the week afterwards, when it was hellish, I thought, well, there's one person in the whole of Ireland who knows my view of gay marriage.
Yes.
And again, going back to that question of openness that we were talking about earlier, if I was in that situation, I believe, and I think maybe you as well, Ferguson, if I may be presumptuous, that even if you disagreed with everything I ever said, right? But you actually were talking to me in the midst of a situation, and I'd given you the inside track on something. And then a few days later, this thing erupted. That suddenly what was on your tape recorder turned out to be completely germane to what was being discussed in the public realm. What would you do? Would you go with your, well, that Waters, it deserves what's coming to him, and I don't agree with him about that anyway? Or would you say, well, actually, I don't particularly agree with him. I don't even like him very much. But in fairness, what he said to me was straight and true, and he was obliging to me in that regard. So I have a duty to tell the world what I know to be about him. Would you not?
That would be the least that you would expect, let's say.
Yeah. Well, that didn't happen. She went the other way. And she started to attack me as if I'd never had an exchange at all, as if she knew nothing, except it was everything that the drag queen had said was true. In fact, she went much further than the drag queen, because she compared me to Vladimir Putin and to Nigerian queer bashers. Now, and then you had other, the great Fenton O'Toole was then called in. And
the Oracle.
Yes, and he was set on me, and he told a series of untruths about me, and it became intolerable. And he was one of Thomas 59's followers. He didn't have many followers, but Fenton was one of them, which is a very interesting sidebar, which nobody has really been able to figure out. What the hell was he doing there? Did he know who Thomas 59 was? How long did he know?
And this is regardless of, again, I want to take this out of context, regardless of Fenton O'Toole's views. He is supposed to be a professional. Yeah. And so is Thomas 59.
Yes.
And regardless of who the hell you are and what the hell you're saying, and what the hell they're saying.
Yes. Well, now you're on to exactly the answer to your question.
Ultimately. For me, they cross lines.
Because somehow, and I'm not being unfair, I hope, but I mean, I know you're speaking to some extent in some of this rhetorically, but your depiction of me as kind of this kind of crazed lone gunman who has been driven insane by his treatment and is taking vengeance on the whole of the Irish media. No, you've just said it there. I mean, those things that you described that were true, that did happen, are the reason that I decided that Irish journalism was totally irredeemably corrupt. So I'm not without evidence. I'm not without a basis.
Fine, and again, I want to make a distinction: evidence for a point, and that, but that doesn't justify absolutely everything that comes out of one's mouth. But anyway, you have a very strong case, and you have a lot to say about, let's say, corruption in Irish journalism. Like you could give a college course on
oh boy.
on that. Know what I mean? Like,
I once did very briefly. I did a couple of courses in a college in town for a couple of years, lecturing on an alternative view of journalism. You know, it was quite stressful, but fun in lots of ways. And I wouldn't mind doing it again sometime. But I don't think I'm going to be getting any invitations anytime soon. But you know, I think yes. You know, but you see, there's an additional aspect of all that too, Fergus, which is that, you know, okay, like, I accept sometimes, you know, I can be a pain in the ass. And I accept that, you know, people get annoyed.
yes.
I might lose the head or whatever. You know, I'm highly strung, shall we say.
Yes.
And my wife is constantly trying to throw buckets of water over me. And you know, like, but I think anybody who knows me knows that what they see is what they get.
Yes.
I'm not going to stab you in the back. I'm going to stab you in the front if I stab you at all, you know?
I get you.
And like, what really made me, I would say, literally ill, and I told you I'd been ill seriously for 2 years, about all of that stuff, was the fact that in all of it, not a single voice emerged from Irish journalism to say, I know John Waters. You know, he's not like that. That's not him. You've got him wrong. He's obsessed with this, and this, maybe, or that's the way they want to characterize it. You know, fine. But he's not what you say he is. He's not motivated by hate of any kind. That's not his character. Nobody said that. They sat on their hands, people who knew me well. And a couple of them wrote to me privately.
Yes.
Which in some ways was comforting, in other ways even more hurtful, you know, that they wouldn't have the bottle to stand up and say this publicly.
Even though they were feeling it. Even though they felt it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. There was one colleague, actually, who sent me a very moving letter in his dead sense. And it was a very powerful letter. And, you know, I admired him greatly, and we disagreed. We used to, you know, we were on TV kicking lumps out of each other, you know. But again, and this seems to be the theme of our conversation, we retained that mutual affection and respect. And we were involved in pretty heavy stuff, you know. And like, that to me, I just is unconscionable. I don't know where that came from. What happened to our country that, you know, I remember when I was a child, and I wrote about this in my first book, Driving at the Crossroads. My father drove a mail car, which is kind of the motif of that book, you know. It's like the traveling stagecoach, or if you wanted to make it postmodern, a kind of a traveling studio, which was, the mail car was, it drove mails from one post office to another, from the main post office in Castlereagh to all the sub offices all around Roscommon and into Mayo. And he also carried, you know, newspapers. We carried all the newspapers all over the place. And we carried day old chicks and passengers. And the passengers would be sitting on the mail bags and the newspapers because there were no seats. But we would have 20 people in the car. I went with them for many years when I was a kid, you know, and a teenager, riding shotgun. And the van would be full of people, like, arguing and fighting and disagreeing politics and you name it. And my father in the front being the referee and the provocateur and the shit stirrer, you know.
The cute whore.
Yes, staggering all over the road, you know, taking both sides with him as he was laughing his head off at people. And in the end, everybody would get out of the van and wave bye-bye to everybody and go off, grumbling or laughing to themselves. Yeah. This was Ireland, you know, beautiful place for all that they demonize it now, beautiful place. And this seems to all have gone now, that if you have a particular position that you want to express by way of an argument, willing to be changed, this is implicit in all discussion, in my view.
The fact that you turn up means that you're open to convincing.
Yes, you put a position, but I mean, there's almost no conversation I've ever been in, you know, meaningful conversation that didn't change my position.
That couldn't have changed your position.
Yes, certainly there's never been one like that, I believe, because I'm always. I'm not that I'm making myself into some kind of.
I get you.
You know, but I think that's the way you got to be, open. That's where you become like an antenna, you know, to pick up things and to see people's point of view and to go into people's personalities and characters and see. That's because I've written plays as well, and that's kind of what the playwriting thing is about. Yeah. Understanding the nuance, you know, subtext, reading. Tom Murphy always said to me, you know, about plays, you know, 99% subtext. Mm-hmm. You know, it's all about, you know, like he described it to me, I'm going off track, but this is worth telling. I mean, I remember him saying to me in the illustration, he says, well, he says, John, you know, he was from Tuam, you know, and he had this way of delivery that was very precise. And he would say, John, imagine two men sitting at a bar. One of them says something to the other. The other answers, and they have a brief spurt of conversation. And then there's a pause. And one of them says to the other, yeah, but what's your name like, you know? He said, every single syllable of that is saturated with meaning. And you see, the journalist is not a playwright necessarily, doesn't have to be, but you need to be aware of the meaning of things. One of the things I've begun to learn.
Just your name, like, what is it? What was the question?
What's your name like? You know, as if to say, well, okay, now you're giving me your opinions, but who are you?
Okay.
You know, can I have your name? It's a very good question in these days of social media. And
give me your real,
Who are you? What's your stake? What's your skin in the game? Yeah. You know, let's not be waffling here for the day. You know, it's all that. And this is what you know, an Irish culture is like this. People, you know, language is very, very, very variegated and subtle. And that's another thing, you know, that I think is precious culturally. And that goes back to the changes that are happening now, because that's going to get ironed out in the process of our so-called multiculturalism. But that's another story. Let's not go back to that. You see, like there's all of this stuff that journalism needs to have. That kind of technology, if you like, human technology, in order to tell people what's happening, what's really happening, and its meaning. What is the truth? What does it mean? What is happening? What might happen next? All this we're losing. We're throwing it away because journalism has become a crude instrument for ideology. And journalists are the handmaidens and hand servants of those ideologies. Mm. That's a serious development in our culture. And the good journalists are actually now aware of this, but too afraid of the culture generally to dissent from it or to resist it. And that's why I couldn't any longer bear to be part of it. I don't write for any Irish newspapers. I write the occasional article for Gript, which is, you know, a promising enough newcomer to the scene.
I enjoy your pieces. I've read a couple of them on First Things. I
would regard First Things as one of the greatest magazines in the world.
Can we pause for 2 seconds?
Surely.